Pete Hegseth had 82 seconds to answer one question that should have taken less than 3. Do you have a Combat Infantryman Badge or a Combat Action Badge? That was it. Not a theory, not a media narrative, not some partisan trap dressed up as oversight. One yes or no question, backed by one military record, one award list, one missing badge, and, according to the source material, 67 separate moments where Pete Hegseth allegedly claimed or implied combat experience. 82 seconds of silence. 0 Combat Infantryman Badge. 0 Combat Action Badge. 0 combat awards listed to prove direct engagement with the enemy. And now, after a Fallujah Marine had already questioned his combat claims, an Army Ranger was doing the same thing from a different direction, with a different badge, a different military tradition, and the same brutal conclusion. That is not a bad hearing. That is a resume being dragged under fluorescent lights until the ink starts sweating. This was not a normal hearing. This was a public audit of military honor, staged inside the House Armed Services Committee, where the usual Washington fog of slogans, flags, applause lines, and cable news toughness suddenly ran into a man who actually knew what combat paperwork looks like. Congressman Pat Ryan did not walk into that room as just another member of Congress looking for a viral clip. He walked in as a West Point graduate, an Army infantry officer, a Ranger School graduate, a 101st Airborne veteran, a man who deployed to Iraq twice in 2006 and 2007, spent 15 months in combat, and earned the Combat Infantryman Badge the way the Army requires it to be earned: by fighting. That is the first thing the audience has to understand. In the Army, combat is not a mood. Infantry is not a branding choice. A badge is not a piece of costume metal you borrow because it looks good next to a patriotic speech. A Combat Infantryman Badge means the soldier was infantry and personally engaged the enemy. A Combat Action Badge exists for non-infantry soldiers who engage the enemy. So Pat Ryan did what a prosecutor does when the witness has spent years sounding bigger than the record. He narrowed the room. He removed the fog. He turned biography into evidence. He placed his own Combat Infantryman Badge on the table and made the entire hearing stare at the difference between documented service and decorated storytelling. Then he asked Pete Hegseth whether he was infantry. Hegseth tried to slide sideways. He said he was in an infantry unit. That answer sounds close enough for television, but not close enough for the Army. Pat Ryan caught it instantly. That was not the question. The question was whether Pete Hegseth held an infantry MOS, whether he was actually 11 series, whether the word he had allegedly used in public matched the military category written in official records. And Hegseth answered no. He was a civil affairs officer. That one answer mattered because it shut one door immediately. No infantry MOS means no Combat Infantryman Badge. So Ryan moved to the second door. Do you have a Combat Action Badge? For Pete Hegseth, that should have been the rescue rope. That should have been the clean receipt. That should have been the answer that stopped the bleeding before the hearing turned into a slow-motion collapse. But when the question landed, Pete Hegseth did not produce a badge. He did not produce an award order. He did not produce a commander's signature. He produced silence. And that silence did what no political attack could do. It made the audience hear the record. Then Pat Ryan moved from the question to the receipts. And that is where the room got colder. Because in Washington, people survive accusations every day. They survive headlines, survive outrage, survive clips, survive speeches. Because most of the time, the argument stays floating in the air. But documents do not float. Documents land. Ryan opened Pete Hegseth's military record and walked through what it showed. National Defense Service Medal, Iraq Campaign Medal, Global War on Terror Service Medal. Service, yes. Deployment, yes. Uniform, yes. But no Combat Infantryman Badge, no Combat Action Badge, no Purple Heart, no Bronze Star with Valor device, no listed combat decoration proving direct engagement with the enemy. even as the source material says Hegseth had allegedly claimed or implied combat experience dozens of times. That distinction is everything. Pat Ryan was not saying Pete Hegseth never served. That would be sloppy, and Ryan was not sloppy. Ryan was saying the story had outrun the record, and in a military context, that is not a small problem. A deployment is not the same as a firefight. Being assigned near infantry is not the same as being infantry. Wearing the uniform is not the same as earning the authority of men who closed with the enemy under fire. Then Ryan played the public claims. When you have been in combat like I have, as an infantry soldier who served in Iraq, my combat experience in Iraq, those lines were not random noise. They were identity claims. They were verbal decorations. They were the kind of phrases that tell veterans, families, voters, and viewers, trust me, because I have been there. But Ryan kept returning to the same brutal gap. If Pete Hegseth had been there in the way he suggested, where was the badge? Where was the award? Where was the commander's signature? Where was the paper trail that follows real combat? That is when the hearing stopped sounding political and started sounding like a courtroom. Ryan stacked the MOS against the language. He stacked the DD-214 against the clips. He stacked the missing badges against the public persona. And the contradiction became impossible to hide. Pete Hegseth allegedly spoke with the confidence of a combat veteran, but the record Ryan presented did not carry the proof. That is not a paperwork technicality. That is the line between service and borrowed valor. Then Pat Ryan turned the hearing away from Pete Hegseth's resume and toward the people who make this question sacred. Because the Combat Infantryman Badge is not just metal. It is memory compressed into a rectangle. It is a patrol that went wrong. It is radio traffic under fire. It is a medic sprinting across open ground. It is a platoon leader counting who came back and who did not. And when Ryan placed that badge on the table, he was not showing off. He was drawing a border. On one side of that border are people who earned the words. On the other side are people who discovered those words sound useful in public. That is why Ryan named the soldiers. Specialist Anthony Mazzarella, Sergeant First Class Daniel Crabtree, Private First Class David Grahams. According to the source material, Ryan used those names to force the room to look past slogans and remember that real combat claims are attached to real bodies, real families, and real empty chairs. That was the moral scene. Not Pete Hegseth being embarrassed. Not Pat Ryan scoring a point. Not Democrats and Republicans trading another clip for the algorithm. The moral scene was this. Dead soldiers earned the language of combat with their lives, while Pete Hegseth was being confronted over whether he had used that same language without the same proof. That is why the silence mattered, because silence is not always empty. Sometimes silence is the sound of a story failing inspection. Sometimes silence is what happens when the slogan reaches the locked door of the record and realizes it does not have the key. Ryan then reached for something deeper than awards. He reached for the Ranger Creed. Never shall I fail my comrades. That line was not decoration either. It was the standard. A Ranger does not just lead in battle. A Ranger protects the meaning of service from people who cheapen it for status. Then Ryan invoked the West Point Honor Code. A cadet will not lie, cheat, steal, or tolerate those who do. And suddenly the case against Pete Hegseth had 4 verbs. Lie, cheat, steal, tolerate, not as loose insults, as a moral framework. If you claim combat you did not document, you lie. If you use that claim to gain authority, you cheat. If you wear the reputation of warriors who actually fought, you steal. And if you let the public repeat it while you fail to correct the record, you tolerate the lie as long as it benefits you. That is the part Pete Hegseth could not spin with a patriotic sentence, because the issue was no longer whether he respected the military. The issue was whether he respected the truth enough not to borrow what other soldiers paid for. And then came the question that stripped away every speech, every brand, every carefully polished version of Pete Hegseth's public identity. Do you have a Combat Infantryman Badge or a Combat Action Badge? A yes would have ended the exchange. A no would have exposed the gap. But Pete Hegseth chose the one answer that made the room feel even heavier. Silence. 10 seconds. 20 seconds. 30 seconds. then a full minute, then 82 seconds. And in those 82 seconds, the hearing became bigger than Pete Hegseth. It became a test of whether military honor still means anything once it enters politics. Because if a public figure can claim the emotional weight of combat without the record that proves it, then every real combat veteran gets pushed 1 inch closer to becoming a prop. Every badge becomes less sacred. Every war story becomes harder to trust. Every family who buried someone who actually fought has to watch another powerful man borrow the language of sacrifice and hope nobody asks for the receipt. That is why Pat Ryan's final words hit like a verdict. He was not saying Pete Hegseth failed to serve. He was saying Pete Hegseth was not infantry, was not a ranger, did not have the combat badges, and was not fit to lead men and women whose lives depend on truth under pressure. That is the real meaning of this event. Not party warfare, not television drama, not another viral committee moment packaged for social media. This was about whether the system still has the courage to separate service from self-promotion. Because a military record is not a mood board. A combat badge is not a campaign slogan. And the dead are not there to correct the living when the living start exaggerating what they did beside their graves. So the final question is not just whether Pete Hegseth had the badge. The final question is whether America is still willing to punish the lie when the lie comes wrapped in a flag, delivered in a confident voice, and sold by someone powerful enough to assume nobody will check. Because if the answer is no, then what exactly are we asking real soldiers to protect? The country? The Constitution? The truth? Or just the careers of men who learned how to sound brave after other people did the fighting? If this breakdown matters, hit like, comment below, and tell me whether Pat Ryan exposed a paperwork issue or a moral failure. Share this video with someone who still believes records matter. And subscribe for more sharp, evidence-based hearing breakdowns where the receipts come first and the excuses come last.